Today I wanted to share with you some personal reflections on what has come to my consciousness from attending most of this year's General Assembly of delegates from Unitarian Universalist Association congregations around the world. I was especially interested in this year's theme, Faithfully Becoming, which I believe is intended to encourage us to actively participate in constructive adaptation and change and transformation, which is always underway in our Unitarian Universalist faith, but maybe particularly now as we're in a post-pandemic phase. The sermons, seminars, and workshops honored who and what we have been and what we have done in the past. But the theme of engaging with the future was intrinsic to the whole experience. For example, my longtime good friend and colleague over the last 20 years, Reverend Chris Bice of Knoxville, was the presenter of the sermon at the Service of the Living Tradition on Thursday evening. His evocative sermon title, Toward Our Metamorphosis into Who Knows What. As you may know, as a featured part of that service, Reverend Scott was recognized for achieving final fellowship along with only 43 other new ministers. Congratulations to Reverend Scott. And following all the rites of passage about transitions among professional leaders, Chris Bice started his sermon by sharing with us his adaptation of the often quoted saying that leading church groups and church members can be like herding cats. You know, cats have a way of coming and going at a whim, insisting on absolute independence as long as they are fed and provided a comfortable place to sleep when they choose to be with us. As we might be honest about it, we could say that we belong to our cats, not the other way around. As perhaps our sociologist Craig would help us agree and understand from human observation. But Chris noticed that congregations can also sometimes be like turtles who want to make change, if at all, very slowly. But unlike our usual quiet image of slow turtles, if we hassle our congregational turtles to move too fast, we may be bitten by the little creatures. So the metaphor that Chris delivered to hearty laughter was that sometimes leading congregations through what may not be comfortable change can be a little like carrying a basket of very lovable snapping turtles to some place where they don't want to go right away. Well, Reverend Scott and I left General Assembly a bit early to be with you this morning, and I'm pleased to have his support and companionship with Joe this morning. It seemed to be a little strange for us to leave before several major events of the week that we typically would want to enjoy, especially the Ware Lecture with the Beacon author Imani Perry last night, and the closing worship, which just is finishing about right now. I believe Scott and I will be watching the recorded version when we can, and I would encourage you to do the same. But it was so great to be there because I take some measure of pride in my long string of annual attendance at General Assembly since the summer I was elected to serve as president of my little fellowship in South Carolina back in 1987. That was probably the earliest tipping point in my 10-year journey toward leaving the practice of law to pursue not first lay ministry and then ordination. Partly because of that consistent attendance over so many years, I have been extremely fortunate to have been an observer and a participant in much of the evolution of our denomination at General Assembly over those 36 years. I believe that helped me adapt and also to encourage and guide the congregation I have served over those years toward constructive adaptation and engagement in the evolution of our denomination. You might ask, what does that adaptation look like over the professional life of one minister? At one point, among the years of my lay and ordained ministry service to about a dozen different UU organizations and congregations, for 1 year I was hired to serve with the UUA staff group, which had major responsibilities at both the 2006 and 2007 General Assembly meetings. I can testify from personal experience that the necessary preparation and participation by staff in those meetings was both exhausting and exciting. Making all the arrangements for a gathering for 3,000 or more folks, even part of the activities, was very complicated. In other General Assembly years, I was active in the choir or called upon to be a representative for various UU organizations in the exhibit hall. Many hours of greeting people and reconnecting with people, being in relationship with people was both very rewarding and very tiring. But this year, my wife Nina and I had no official responsibilities at all. So we spent much of our time just reconnecting in informal ways with longtime friends from many congregations. With those personal commitments and energy limitations of our advancing years, we had few opportunities to actively participate in person at the business meetings. We knew that the virtual attendance online was an option for us as well as for any of you, but after traveling all the way to Pennsylvania to be present, it was disappointing that we couldn't actually be present for so much of what was going on. It was our loss. But as you probably know, virtual attendance is becoming more the norm than the exception for the vast majority of Unitarian Universalists. We know that it's more economical and practical, but it's not what attracts us about participation at all. So we are very personally very resistant to accepting those necessary changes and expectations about what we remember as the comfortable patterns we have shared with others over those many years of our experience. But perhaps those of us who are literally physically present today inside this building here this morning are showing a kind of personal testimony about our resistance to the technology of Zoom and Facebook, which has become so dominant in our experience of all kinds of gatherings over the past 4 years. I'll bet some of you with me here today may still prefer to read books and newspapers on paper, believe it or not. But I know I'm in a shrinking proportion of 21st century church folks. Those of you who are watching this service right now, or maybe sometime in the future, in what is called time shifting, have made your choice. It's a choice for personal safety and health, for individual convenience, for the possibility of multitasking during the service without the risk of discovery. That's a more reasonable and more practical approach than for all of us to try to follow pre-COVID patterns of church attendance. We probably can't have church that way. It may never be the same as it used to be. And that's something that we have to live with. That church means something different all the time. It's changing. I understand Darwin's theory of evolution made the point that survival of species is totally determined by their ability to adapt to long-term changes in the environment, whatever you might include in the environment. I'm relieved to know that our children and grandchildren are already successfully adapting to changing circumstances, even though I'm resistant to many of those changes. I have to admit, looking at it a little dispassionately, I'm acting a lot like my own grandfathers did 50 or 60 years ago. Resisting change. But what are the major challenges and changes which we know our Unitarian Universalist community is now facing and actually welcoming? First, there's been an increasingly active embrace of what we used to know as marginal identities. In the 1980s and 90s, and even before that, UU ministers and congregations began to overtly shelter and embrace gay and lesbian ministers, especially during the AIDS pandemic. Urban congregations encouraged active engagement with civil rights leaders, even beginning in the 60s when I was in high school. Even before I graduated from seminary, all UU ministers were given permission and encouragement to perform ceremonies of commitment for same-sex couples, years before their civil marriages were formally recognized anywhere in this country. But it wasn't long before gay, lesbian, and transgender folks were encouraged and ordained into UU ministry in significant numbers. We know the Pride Parade that was held in Houston here yesterday was something that many of us became participants in many years ago, 30, 40 years ago, when they were first celebrating Stonewall and saying this is something, a change that's coming, a change that's necessary, a change to embrace folks who are different than majority. Within 2 or so years after my ordination, despite a long history of patriarchal custom, the majority of UU ministers identified as female, and we have a growing proportion of folks who have different sexual identities or gender identities as UU ministers. Before and after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, the UUA became much more intentionally engaged with what became Black Lives Matter movements and the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalists, more intentionally promoting and engaging with anti-oppression programs that have become stronger and stronger. Over the past 3 years, we've seen the widespread discussion and adoption of the new 8th principle, including by this church, which calls upon all of us to active engagement with anti-racism and anti-oppression programs as a part of our religious identity. And now this summer, we have received the report of the Study Commission on the Article 2, the purposes of the Unitarian Universalist Association itself, which has worked hard to identify our unifying principles and purposes in a way that's actually inclusive. A lot of detail, which I summarize with the primary purpose clause, section C-2.1. The purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love. Now, that seems self-evident to me, but it's also challenging. And part of what's challenging about it is that it means we have to get rid of our attachment to the 7 or 8 principles as the guiding statement of purpose, and actually engage with the new paradigm, which includes 6 spirals around a central circle which says love in a chalice. Now, you may not have actually come across this symbolic depiction of the shared values of Unitarian Universalists, so I'll describe it briefly. The 6 spirals coming out of the circle of love include justice, interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, and generosity. Hear that? Transformation? That's the restatement of the love principle that's already in the center of this new pictograph. But what do we have to face when we let go of Roy G. Biv? Do you remember those initials? That's what we told our children to help them remember what the principles were, the 7 principles. And for those of us who were much more restrained and maybe constrained in our memories, I had to remember for a long time to direct people to the front of the hymnal where the 7 principles were listed on paper. But letting go of some of that is about maybe an extent of grief, of And I found this quote from somebody named Jeff Chu. He said, "Grief is the love that has to find a place to go now that the institution or the person we're grieving is no longer immediately present." You know, to deal with grief, most of us have come across the Kubler-Ross grief cycle: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Those are pretty familiar to many of us. But I found when I started looking that there's now a different change paradigm for accepting change. And I looked that up, and it turns out there's something called a change curve, where there are stages to our becoming, either accepting and embodying and understanding how change can happen, and then allowing ourselves to live with change. It's adapted from Kubler-Ross. Stage 1 begins when a change is first introduced, where people's initial reaction may be shock or denial, like grief. This can sometimes manifest by blaming others as they react to the challenge of the status quo. People then move to stage 2 of the change curve and become critical of themselves. Why can't I go along with this? What's wrong with me? And for so long as people, because of their resistance to change, they can remain at stages 1 and 2, and the change will not be successful for the people who react. It's a stressful, unpleasant stage, but people can waver between these stages for a while. Stage 3 is when confusion and doubt come in, but it's a good sign because people are beginning to move on in uncertainty and confusion and doubt. Signs of acceptance will shine through as they may ask questions like, do I carry on with my commitments in this new paradigm? What will my role be? What will I lose? What could I gain? How do I relate to the new model of being part of this church? At stage 4 of the change curve, there's acceptance and rationalization, when people stop focusing on what they may have lost and they start to let go of the old models and begin to think about accepting the changes by testing and exploring what the changes actually mean. And so they actually learn the reality of what's good and not so good, and then how they must adapt. It is useful to be cautious at this stage of acceptance or rationalization because you can slide back into doubt. It's very common. By stage 5, the stage of solutions and problem solving, people have not only accepted change, but maybe even begun to embrace them because they are able to begin to rebuild their ways of relating to each other. Only when people get to this stage can the whole organization begin to reap the benefits of the change that's already happening. So this is where new ideas and innovation can blossom, in possibly restructuring what church looks like when you go into the building or when you don't go into the building. Whether Sunday morning is the primary focus for you or other activities that are generated by this spirit of innovation, this acceptance of change that's already happening. And then finally, stage 6, where change becomes so normal and there are routines and it's a new status quo, and there's a feedback loop that should be built in where there's a review process for more change because it's going to keep changing. And we understand that what's important is how we relate to each other, not the structure that's there or the words that we use, but rather the actual sense of belonging to something that's important to all of us, where our values are celebrated and our energies are appreciated. the energies that we bring to this transformation cycle. You know, when the new ministers were recognized and we had this wonderful sermon, they didn't turn into butterflies. As much as the metamorphosis of Chris Bice's service was about recognizing that sometimes the change is so drastic that we initially, when we're faced with it, when we come out of our chrysalis into the air and start flapping our wings, we may say, "Who am I? I'm not the caterpillar anymore." And much as that might be true of the congregations as a whole, or the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations also, that we have to come out of the chrysalis with the understanding that we won't be the same, but it is not only conceivable and possible, but it's very likely that we will be able to better function in the world that's already changed around us, because we will have the wings we need to fly. Thank you for your attention this morning.